So Paul's been in front of the council, the Jewish council, and he just really pretty stealthily, in a wise way, he just says, just kind of sneaking his way around the place, says, "Hey, I'm on trial for the resurrection of the dead," and gets the Pharisees and the Sadducees fighting. And he knows that his goal in all of this is he's feeling called. He's got to go to Rome. He's in Jerusalem now. He felt he had to go to Jerusalem, but he knows his ultimate thing is, I need to get to Rome. And so all of this stuff that's happening here is in that process of getting him there. So after this encounter here with the Jewish council, it says on verse 11 of chapter 23, "But on the night immediately following, the Lord stood at his side and said, 'Take courage, for as you have solemnly witnessed to my cause at Jerusalem, so you must witness at Rome also.'" That can give you a lot of confidence if the Lord himself stands by your side and say, "You know what, I'm going to send you to Rome." Even though he's under threat of beating, imprisonment, people trying to kill him. And we find right after this, what happens is, amazingly, God works. God just doesn't put oh, and a covering falls down and no one can touch Paul. Actually, he's working through the people around him. And so Paul's nephew hears a conspiracy that they're going to kill Paul. They're waiting to kill him. And people have made a vow and they're going to fast until they see him dead. And they're waiting to capture him. They're going to call and say, "Hey, we want to talk to have Paul come in. We're going to talk to him again." But on the way, there's people waiting to kill him. And his nephew, his sister's son, hears about it and tells Paul, and Paul tells the authorities. And so they sneak him out of Jerusalem and take him to Caesarea. And so, it's interesting that, it seems like God could just say, there's a protection over Paul, and they throw spears at him, and they try and beat him, and nothing can touch him. But no, he uses, a relative, a young man to tell the story that he overheard. He happened to overhear. God's got his ways, and he's got his people in different places, but it's not like we would think, like, why doesn't he just throw like this invisible force field over him and keep him safe, because he's going to get him to Rome. He just said that. But instead he uses his nephew, and he tells the authorities. And so they decide they're going to send him to Caesarea, so they send him under military guard, and he gets to Caesarea. And they sent a letter with him, and he's going there to appear before Felix, who's it says he's the governor, I believe, at that time. And so we look at chapter 24. It says, Paul's before Felix. It says, "After 5 days, the high priest Ananias came down with some elders, with a certain attorney named Tertullus, and they brought charges to the governor against Paul." So they're kind of trying to bring something against him. They're wanting to kill Paul. I mean, they really want to get rid of him. He has been a threat to the Jewish authorities. He had been one of the most highly regarded intellectuals in the Jewish community. He studied, we read in these passages back here at the end of Acts, that he studied under Gamaliel, who was kind of the renowned teacher of the Jewish faith. And so Paul had a great reputation. All of a sudden he turns. He's going out killing Christians, and all of a sudden he's defending Christians and saying, "You guys are the murderers. You murdered Christ. And you're trying to murder these people." And so Paul has become like public enemy number one among the Jews, for sure. So we get down. He defends himself before Felix. He gives kind of the same message over and over again through this passage of what happened to him. And here he's actually explaining to Felix like the history of Judaism in some ways. We get down to verse 24. Felix decides he's not going to make any judgment on him. And this Felix apparently doesn't like to make any judgments on anything. He probably just enjoys his position, whining and dining or whatever, because we see in here he doesn't do much of anything. But in verse 24 it says he waits, and then it says some days later Felix arrived with Drusilla, his wife, who was a Jewess. She was a Jew, and he was married to her, and sent for Paul and heard him speak about faith in Christ Jesus. And as he was discussing righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come, Felix became frightened and said, "Go away for the present. When I find time, I'll summon you." So Felix is like, he's coming under conviction. When Paul's talking specifically about righteousness, self-control, and judgment, the judgment to come, Felix gets pretty nervous and says, "Get out of here. I'll decide your case later." And so we get the last verse of chapter 24, verse 27. "After 2 years had passed," after 2 years, "I'll hear your case later." After 2 years had passed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus, and wishing to do the Jews a favor, Felix left Paul in prison. So he didn't make any decision on anything. He just waited till the next guy comes and is going to take over his position. This guy does nothing. He got scared when Paul started talking about judgment and righteousness and self-control, and he just, get out of here. I'll take care of this later, and then he takes care of nothing. So this Festus takes over for Felix, and we go. That's all in chapter 25, and because the essence of it here is because Paul has appealed to Caesar, Festus says, well, we've got to send him to Caesar, and basically they've kind of come to the conclusion, there's not enough against him to do anything. We could release him, but he's appealed to Caesar, and now he's got to go there. That's the legal process. So they've got to send him to Rome here, and so there's a man that comes on the scenes, King Agrippa. He shows up, and Agrippa is the Herod of this time. We know of Herod the Great, and the Herod during the time of Jesus, and the Herod that ended up trying Jesus and wanted to see a miracle and all those kind of things. Well, this is the new king of Judea at the time, Herod Agrippa. I think it's Herod the Great's grandson, I believe. Anyway, in chapter 26, verse 1 through 3, it says, "And Agrippa said to Paul, 'You are permitted to speak for yourself.'" Paul's making his defense before King Agrippa. "Then Paul stretched out his hand and proceeded to make his defense." Verse 2, "In regard to all of the things of which I am accused by the Jews, I consider myself fortunate, King Agrippa, that I am about to make my defense before you today, especially because you are an expert in all the customs and questions among the Jews. Therefore, I beg you to listen to me patiently." So Paul is not going to appeal to Agrippa, who's very familiar with all the Jewish customs and all of that. And so Paul's feeling like this is a good opportunity for me to share. And so Paul goes through his whole testimony again, and talks about his road to Damascus, the experience that he had there, the call that God had on his life. And so that's what we see in chapter 26, essentially. And we get to the end, or near the end, verse 24. It says, "And while Paul was saying this in his defense, Festus said in a loud voice, 'Paul, you're out of your mind. Your great learning is driving you mad.'" When he's talking about, he talks about how Jesus called him and how he's struck down, and this dead man Jesus appears to him. He's risen from the dead. He talks about the resurrection of the dead, and these guys listen to him, Festus and Agrippa. Finally, Festus says, "You're out of your mind, Paul. You're really an intelligent guy, but your great learning has caused you to go crazy." But Paul said to him in verse 25, "I'm not out of my mind, most excellent Festus, but I utter words of sober truth. For the king knows," he's pointing back to Agrippa now, "about these matters, and I speak to him also with confidence, since I am persuaded that none of these things escape his notice. For this has not been done in a corner. King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets?" And Paul says, "I know that you do." And Agrippa replied to Paul, "In a short time you will persuade me to become a Christian." And Paul said, "I would to God that whether in a short time or a long time, not only you, but also those who hear me this day might become such as I am, except for these chains." And so Paul's preaching to King Agrippa and Festus and those in the court there that are listening, and Agrippa's kind of coming under conviction. He says, "You're liable to, convince me to be a Christian if I keep listening to you. These guys, this is disrupting their lifestyle. Commitment to Jesus could be a real rough thing, and shaking them out of their high positions and their royalty and all of this kind of thing." So what's happening here is all of this legal thing, Paul making his defense, Paul getting a chance to witness before kings. Just like Jesus said, don't worry about what you're going to say when you're in front of them. I'm going to put words in your mouth. He told us in Matthew 24 and those places. Well, Paul wasn't in the audience right at that time in Matthew 24, but Paul is receiving the benefits of what Jesus said, is that the Holy Spirit will give you what to say in that time. And so Paul's getting a chance to preach to rulers. And all of this legal stuff is basically just the roadmap or the procedure that got Paul to Rome. And so we get to the end of chapter 26 and verse 30. It says, "And the king arose, and the governor and Bernice," I think that's the king's wife, "and those who were sitting with them. And when they had drawn aside, they began talking to one another, saying, 'This man is doing is not doing anything worthy of death or imprisonment.' And Agrippa said to Festus, this man might have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar. So they've come to the conclusion and saying, Paul, we could let him go. I mean, the things that the Jews have brought up against him, nothing is there's not a strong enough accusation against him that could hold him here or get him sentenced to death or anything. We could let him go, except he's appealed to Caesar, and now we've got to follow the process, and he has to go to make his case before Caesar. So that's where we end at chapter 26. Paul's on his way to Rome, and he's going to appeal to Caesar.